the mariner says towards the end, I pass like night from land to land. I have strange power of speech. The moment that his face I see, I know the man who must hear me. To him my tale I teach. And we realize at the end that this was not random at all, that this person needed to hear this story at this point and was completely changed by it. And that has been the experience for many readers of the poem. They've known it for a bit, they liked it, they knew the famous phrases. Even if you haven't recently read it, you will all know parts of the Ancient Mariner. You will all have somewhere in your minds, water, water everywhere. All the boards did shrink, water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. You'll all have somewhere the idea of an albatross tied round your neck. You might have the phrase, a sadder and a wiser man. There'll be scraps of it. But there are also, certainly for some people, and I'm one of them, a sense that at some point in your life, the poem, rather like the mariner himself, grips you and says, come with me. I'm going to take you on a needful journey, a journey that may change the way you see the world. Certainly, the poem itself seemed to have burst into Coleridge's life and stopped him in his tracks, much as the mariner stops the wedding guest. Coleridge believed that he ought at some point to write a long, great, massive, learned, serious, epic poem in full Miltonic grandeur, addressing the mystery of our fallenness and brokenness, the mystery of evil in the world, the problem of redemption, and at the same time doing so without the immediate Miltonic references fully and explicitly to the Bible, but trying to rephrase those things in a new way. And he believed that somehow it would also involve some odes and hymns. He wanted to write an ode to the sun and to the moon and 4 odes to each of the 4 elements. And he filled his notebooks, and that was task A, the big project. He never did it. He kept on being interrupted and stopped by one thing or another. And when he and Wordsworth in the winter or the late autumn of 1797 wanted to go on a walking tour together in Somerset, they hit upon the novel idea that one of them, or both of them perhaps together as a joint effort, could knock off a quick poem, just a sort of schlock horror gothic ballad, and sell it to a journal for a £5, and that would pay for the trip. It would cover the expenses of the walking tour. And that's actually inauspiciously how the mariner started. But soon the tale gripped Coleridge, and he realized he had something much more to say, and he became fully absorbed in it. And it wasn't a quick story. In the end, the first full version of it was finished by March of the following year, and it had grown to a poem of some 600 lines. But he never quite let it go. He kept coming back to it. And then years later, he wrote the wonderful gloss, which speaks to the text and interprets it. And what he wrote was really something extraordinary. The poem itself, like the Odyssey before it, has the classic shape of a journey out and back again. An unnamed ship, the purpose of whose journey we're never told, leaves the familiar, sails south across the line into the southern hemisphere, comes at last to the great ice floes of the Antarctic. The sailors are lost in fog, surrounded by ice. There is nowhere for them to sail. There's no shapes of men nor beast we ken. The ice was all between. You feel the ice which cracks and growls is going to close in on them. And then, unexpectedly, they see life as sheer grace. At length did cross an albatross. Thorough the fog it came, and then they see it glimmering in the moonlight, and they hail it as a Christian soul. They don't know that this is the bird that will save them, because in the end, the albatross flies towards what looks like impassable ice. And as it says, like the ice did split in a thunder fit, and the helmsman steered us through. Wonderful. All these human sailors dependent on this other life form who gets them a passage. And you think, well, they'd be jolly pleased and say thank you very much to the albatross. And of course, at this point, we zoom out of the story and Coleridge has the wedding guest say, God shield thee, ancient mariner, from fiends that plague thee thus. Why look'st thou so? With my crossbow, I shot the albatross. That's how the first part of the poem finishes. This random, strange, inexplicable, wanton act of destruction. Just when everything is going perfectly, the mariner does something which not only wrecks his own life, but ruins that of those around him. But that's how we are as human beings, isn't it? Sometimes that's just what we do. The rest of the poem goes on to explore the profound spiritual and material consequences of this seemingly random deed, which, as the poem proceeds, takes on the resonance, the spiritual significance of the primal fall of humankind, of the fall of each of us. And the crew make themselves complicit in the deed. At first they blame him and they hang the albatross. And then they say, oh no, it was actually, you killed the bird that saved us, that's bad, we blame you. Then the next thing is they say, oh no, you killed the bird that brought the fog and mist, we've got better weather now, so it's probably right to kill the bird. So in fact they take, as it were, an entirely instrumental view. The bird is there to serve their purposes or not, it has no life of its own. But of course, as the poem unfolds, we realize that the albatross indeed has its own proper life, its own proper meaning, and that they learn eventually through a dream that in this one random, arrogant act of human destructiveness, they have disturbed a delicate balance in the polar region. They have unleashed unimaginable forces which they cannot cope or contend with. We discover in the poem that there is a deep animus or spirit, the polar spirit, 9 fathoms deep beneath the keel, who is, as it were, the guardian spirit of the whole polar region and who loves the albatross. In fact, we also learn that the albatross loved the man who shot it. And as the poem proceeds, these unbalanced and at first hostile and vengeful forces are unleashed. The poem goes on to tell of the death of the other sailors, the survival of the mariner in an agony of helpless guilt and isolation, in which he curses himself and every other living thing and wishes only to die. And then, at the 0 point, as it were, comes, just as the albatross had come in the moonlight, comes another moment, a second moment of unlooked for and unexpected grace. The mariner is so isolated, so full of agony, that he says, 1,000 slimy things lived on and so did I. He's full of self-loathing. He looks at these water snakes and curses them. But then the moon rises and he looks again. And this time, at last, he forgets himself. He looks at them all as having their own particular and proper and in its own way beautiful and happy life. He says, oh, happy living things, no tongue their beauty might declare. My kind saint took pity on me. I blessed them unaware. And in that blessing, in that renewed vision, in that, if you like, self-forgetfulness and going out wider into the web of creation, something is released in his heart. The albatross falls off and he's able to pray. The poem then goes on to show how he eventually returns, aided by angels, his growing spiritual awareness, his discernment of voices that show the height and depth of what he's been going through, his final complete shipwreck as the whole ship goes down, a pilot's boat coming and rescuing him like one that hath been 7 days drowned, his confession, his absolution, and his vocation to share something of what he learnt of grace and humility and a new, humbled and chastened approach to the wider creation. All of those things happen to the mariner. Now, the extraordinary thing, the astonishing thing, is that although Coleridge was only a 25, a carefree young man of 25, when he composed this poem. Astonishingly, every one of those narrative elements that I've listed can be paralleled, symbolically or in image, in Coleridge's life as he came to live it after the composition of the poem. And one of the things I've tried to do in the book is to bring out those parallels. But one might just quickly observe that, like the mariner, Coleridge sailed away from home, from all that was familiar, both outwardly in his life-changing journeys to Germany and Malta. When he wrote the poem, he'd never even been to sea. Within months, he was sailing across the North Sea and eventually right across the Mediterranean. But he also sailed inwardly, deep into the nightmare world of opium addiction and high into the rarefied regions of metaphysical speculation. Like his mariner, Coleridge endured the agony of loneliness, despair, suicidal thoughts. But also, like his mariner, Coleridge survived the ordeal. He was rewarded with visionary experiences of transfigured beauty in the world, and he returned from his voyage into extremity with a new sense of purpose. And just as the mariner met the pilot and the hermit at the moment his ship was sinking and was rescued by them, so Coleridge was rescued from the shipwreck that he was making of his own life, the shipwreck of addiction and despair, by Dr. Gilman, with whom he lived his last years. And in the final phase, Coleridge became, like his mariner, a life-transforming teacher, sharing a spiritual vision which linked love and prayer. Practical and mystical love, practical and empathetic prayer, bringing them together again, not separating them out. And also a new humility towards God and nature. So not surprisingly, later, towards the middle of his life, Coleridge came to realize that he was in fact his own mariner, came sometimes to refer to himself as that in the beautiful and painfully honest notebooks that he kept throughout his life. And one might ask, how could that possibly have happened? How was it that this 25-year-old could somehow intuit, could somehow sense this profound spiritual journey that hadn't actually happened to him yet? There's a very interesting and beautiful passage about the poetic imagination in the book he published in 1817 called Biographia Literaria, exactly 200 years ago. He published it as a companion to a book of his poems in which at last he published The Mariner with the gloss and with his own name on it. And in that book, he has an astonishing analogy, as it were, for the imagination, which he calls at that stage in the book, in his own beautiful phrase, the sacred power of self-intuition. And what Coleridge says is, he says, you see, when a little, he uses the example of the horned fly, the little creature which still at the pupa stage is going to metamorphose, but is making its chrysalis, making the hardened, holding open the shape into which it will grow and develop. And he says it makes the long protective cones, the shape, for the antennae, which it hasn't yet got, to grow into. He says that's the way the imagination works. It holds open for us, keeps a space, holds open a shape into which we will grow, gives us a sense. And that's why we need artists, why we need poets, why we need musicians, because they can sometimes do that for us. They can intuit that and hold that open. And that's why in a really great piece of music, a great piece of art, a great poem like The Mariner, we keep returning to it, and we've grown a little more into it. It feels more spacious. We begin to realize more and more of what it is or has always been saying to us, which we haven't quite got ourselves. And it's a very beautiful passage. He says, let me read you the direct quotation. He says, he adds the further symbol, the wings of the air sylph are forming within the skin of the caterpillar. Those only who feel in their own spirits the same instinct which impels the chrysalis of the horned fly to leave room in its involucrum for antennae yet to come, They know and feel that the potential works in them, even as the actual works on them. So he wrote this poem early, and then he began, in some ways, to live into it. But he lived into all of it. Not just the lovely voyage at the beginning and the glorious views, the great descriptions. Not just the nightmare and agony of life in death and the doldrums and the water everywhere. That tends to be where people who tell Coleridge's life stop. They say, oh yes, genius romantic poet, probably depressive, used opium, made a terrible mess of his life, end of story. But actually it was not the end of the story.